I find it just incredibly difficult to imagine that, given South Africa's history, there's a political party that says race doesn't matter to a black voter who has been, who lives with the consequences of a racialized system, who has political opponents who feast on that racial resentment. And to imagine that you would be able to crack that particular electoral conundrum, I think I'm incredibly doubtful.
My name is Donald. I'm filling in for Petrus, who is currently attending an ANC family meeting. This is WorldView, and at WorldView we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've liked our content so far and enjoyed it, please consider liking this video, subscribing, and donating on Patreon. Today we're talking with Dawie Scholtz. Dawie has an MBA from the University of Cape Town and a MAM from Yale University. He has worked at the Democratic Alliance and most recently as an election analyst at News 24. He is currently a project leader at the Boston Consulting Group. Dawie, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Donald. It's good to be here.
So Dawie, the next local election, why do you think it's going to happen, and do you think it's going to happen this year?
So I think the second question on whether it's going to happen or not this year is probably the more difficult one to answer. I think the answer is no one really knows, right? There's this court process ongoing. We'll see. I get the sense that the IEC will get their way. So probably if you had to force me to make a prediction, I'd say it's probably going to be early next year. But I actually have no factual basis for saying that. So I think there's a court process that needs to proceed, and we'll see how it turns out. But probably early next year, I think. And then the first part of your question, just on next year's election, it's super interesting. I think it's it's probably one of the most unpredictable and unknowable elections we've had in a while for a number of reasons. So I think the one way that I have in the past thought about election expectations and tried to create some sort of baseline of an expectation before the election takes place is to look at the voting patterns in by-elections, right? So South Africa kind of has this regular pattern of local government by-elections which take place usually almost weekly or almost second or third week under normal circumstances. And those are super useful because you basically get random samples of voters, and if you know how to analyze the results coming out of those by-elections, you can actually create an intelligent view on what's happening in the entire electorate if the sample is large enough.
But isn't the turnout very low, like really low?
Yes, absolutely. But for us to believe that that's a problem, you'd have to say that the people who turn out somehow have a fundamentally different perspective and fundamentally different preference than the people who do not turn out. And the classical example is if you take the result from, say, a ward in, let's say, Soweto, so it's demographically homogenous, you know what the demographics are of that area, it's 100% black, it's an urban township, you know what the language distribution is, and let's say the turnout was, in a voting station of 2,000 people, was 15%, so insanely low. So you have the votes of 300 people. You actually have a pretty good sample. You have 300 voters, and you have a view of what their preference is. And it's an argument that
it's almost like a mini opinion poll, if you can compare it.
Exactly, a non-random sampled opinion poll. So you need to know how to manipulate and analyze that data to be able to use it properly. But the argument about very low by-election turnout and it not being useful for analysis, I think, is not particularly relevant, because if that were to hold true, then the 300 people who voted in Soweto would have to be somehow different than the 1,700 people who didn't vote. Maybe they are, but the methodology that I've been using and the historical trends that we've seen suggest that they're not. So in any event, we kind of, very long answer to say, we haven't had a lot of by-elections recently, and by-elections were stopped due to COVID a while ago, and even when we had them, they were very infrequent. So we just don't have good samples of voters for by-elections to look at to form expectations for this election. That's one piece of the answer. The second piece of the answer is we've not had any public polling this year whatsoever. And in the past, our public polling before the elections have been pretty long way off anyway. So I think that's not particularly useful from our perspective. And then finally, we've had super disruptive shocks to our political system in the last couple of weeks with unrest, and no electoral data that we can gather after these shocks. So we're frankly, in my opinion, kind of going into this election relatively blind. So I certainly, for the last two elections, I have relatively successfully made pre-election predictions. I'm not going to make a prediction this time. I just don't think it's quantitatively and credibly possible to do so. Having said all of that, right, so that's basically everything we don't know, and what we don't know is overwhelming, and therefore I won't make any predictions. But there is a little bit that we do know, and the little bit that we do know is the results from the by-elections earlier in the year, right? So results from elections late last year and early this year, where some trends seem to be apparent. Whether those trends will hold or not is now completely uncertain, and therefore we don't know. But the trends that existed at the time were basically what looked to me like stable performance by the EFF and ANC in the black electorate, and sort of disastrous performance by the DA in the white Afrikaans electorate, losing support to the Freedom Front Plus, and the DA losing support to kind of everyone in the coloured electorate, which is, I think, really impactful for the DA, given what a large portion of their base is made up of those voter groups. So I think the trends that existed were bad for the DA and kind of good for particularly the smaller parties who seem to be feeding off a little bit of DA support, but whether that's going to hold into the election is now totally uncertain in my view. I have a feeling that what happened could be quite useful for the DA electorally in many ways. Shocks to the system like this often create tribal effects, which probably will help the DA to some extent. But in any case, it's a long answer to say we just don't know.
On that note, polling is quite underrated or not very utilized in South Africa in comparison to like first world countries. Why is that? Why don't we have more polls? Because I think it's a great way to influence like public opinion. For example, if you can have like a poll every week that's like ask people, are you in favor of Eskom remaining there? And 80% of people say privatize it. That would put a lot of pressure on the ANC to get rid of it. Why don't we have more polls in South Africa?
It's just extremely expensive, right?
Okay.
It's for a poll of 1,000 people, and anything less in my view is useless. A poll of 1,000 people that asks a battery of proper questions to get to the bottom of something slightly complex, like who people want to vote for or whether they want to privatize Eskom or not, would be talking between 1 and 2 million rand, for example. To run a poll of that nature, and there's just not that many polling buyers in South Africa. So one of the major generators of polling in wealthier countries is the media, right? So the media sanctions polls, pays for those polls, and then publishes those polls, and then people want to read those publications because they're interested to see what the polls say. Unfortunately, our media in South Africa is simply not as deep pocketed as some of their foreign
competitors.
Yeah, exactly. And so we just don't, unfortunately, have that opportunity. There is a lot of constant polling taking place within the political parties. They do some internal tracking, but they obviously do not always make that public.
So the riots, how do you think that's going to influence in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng? How's that going to influence the local elections? It's going to put a real pressure on the ANC on their votes. Is it going to be a dampener on turnout?
It's extremely difficult to know, right? I honestly think anything you say about this with any level of certainty, I think is a very dangerous statement. Like, I don't think it's safe to say it's going to be a dampener on turnout. Like, I think maybe people are infuriated with what happened and they really, really feel like voting one way or another. I think you can construct 10 different arguments about how this would go, all who are credible. Here's one argument that I think is very credible, is that voters, particularly black ANC voters, traditional ANC voters, who are 80% of the electorate, will perceive this as an attack on the ANC, and in particular as an attack on Cyril Ramaphosa by forces inside the ANC who want to harm and damage him and the government, and may actually even be super motivated to go out and vote in defense of the ANC. That's one argument which is plausible. I don't know if it's right or not, but that's one that's plausible in my mind. there's a different argument, which is those very same voters are very frustrated by the handling of COVID, are very frustrated by the instability and the seemingly poor handling thereof, blame the ANC for not being able to contain its own internal kind of frictions and spilling out into the open in that way, in a really damaging way for the country, and therefore people feel like maybe there's some portion of people who want to put damage or kind of hold the ANC to account for that. That's a potentially viable argument. I don't know if it's true or not. We have absolutely no data to kind of say it or to kind of talk about it. There's a different argument about what it pertains for the minority electorate, which I think is relatively credible in my mind, but again, we have no evidence about it, which is that I think it's highly likely that this is going to cause kind of tribal effects in our electorate. So I could see white voters, colored voters, Indian voters, minority voters rallying to kind of their old base party, the DA, right? So it may be good for the DA from that perspective, but who knows, right? We have no data on that. And from a turnout perspective, I think it's really very difficult to predict what it means. The final point to make, which is maybe the most credible answer, is that actually it's not going to have that much of an electoral impact. We've seen in South African history, but since 1994, kind of like insane events occurring that have no electoral impact on South Africa because voters are insanely loyal to their parties and really, really set in their electoral ways. And there's only a very minor sliver of the electorate that actually is undecided or willing to think about voting for a different party. And so the folks who are going to vote ANC are still going to vote ANC, and the folks who are going to vote DA are still going to vote DA, and the outcome is still going to be roughly the same. I think it's super, super difficult to say, and anyone who makes a prediction about it, I think don't know what they're talking about, frankly.
Fair point. So you've been an analyst for News 24. I watched many of the analysis you made during the 2019 election. So now in this election, what municipalities should we be looking at? What are going to be, like the Americans would say, the swing states, the swing municipalities that we should be focusing on?
Yeah. So we've done some detailed modeling looking at the voting patterns from 2019, right? And saying, well, if you look at the 2019 results and assuming things stay ballpark the same, maybe some things will change, but like roughly the trends hold in that direction, then probably there's a couple of things that are true. So firstly, all of the Gauteng metro municipalities are going to be extremely marginal. So we know that no one won 50% in Tshwane and Johannesburg last time, and Ekurhuleni was very close to 50%. I think it's highly likely to be the same again, right? So we're going to have the ANC be the largest, certainly in Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni, but whether they can carry 50% is highly uncertain. In Tshwane, the DA was actually the largest party in the low 40s, and the ANC came just below them. I think it's highly likely that there's still a hung council outcome in Tshwane. It's just who's the largest, right? And what the coalition arrangements are. It's going to be interesting. Then I think. So I'll start with the metros. The metros are all quite interesting, or many of them are interesting. I think Nelson Mandela Bay will again be very interesting. So the DA was the largest party, was able to form a government there, right? Coalition government. I think it's probably likely to be a hung council again. Probably the DA is in with a shot, but still being the largest party if they can hold the coloured vote in Nelson Mandela Bay. We'll have to wait and see. That's a big question mark at this stage. And then in Cape Town, the DA had like a 2/3 majority, like a historically large majority in 2019 and in 2016 in particular. And I think it's very doubtful that they'll hold those 2/3, right? So I think they're going to come down in Cape Town. The question is just how much. I'm quite certain they will hold the city of Cape Town, but the current trend suggests they'll take a knock, but they won't lose it. They won't get under 50%, but who knows, right? And then I think the really interesting sleeper here is eThekwini, Durban. So even before the debates, that was a very interesting situation because if you look at the results from 2019 and also the turnout pattern from 2016, and you combine those two things, which we can have a conversation about that, but that's how one should intelligently look at the expectations for a local government election. The kind of eThekwini result suggests an ANC in the very low 50s, so just sort of barely scraping by, like 51, 52. So they're definitely going to be the largest party in eThekwini, but whether they make 50 or not will be interesting, and it will just be an amazing historical result for them to be under 50 in eThekwini. They've been like deep into the 60s there for a very long time, and what's driving that is basically young black voters in the suburbs. Going to the EFF. So an enormous bleed off to the EFF among the urban townships in eThekwini. And then the Zuma effect will now well basically have to wait and see what happens there, right? So I think that one's interesting. But that's one way to say, what are you looking at is the results in the major metros. But actually on election night, I think there's kind of, because the metros report last, there's other things to look at, kind of indicators that are very interesting. I think the one thing that's very interesting to look at is just a couple of the key bellwether smaller municipalities, right? And there's one municipality in particular which is a very interesting forerunner for Nelson Mandela Bay. It's a municipality called Koga, which is right next to NMB. It's Jeffreys Bay and surrounds, and it's a majority coloured area, traditionally won by the ANC. That had a massive swing to the DA, driven by white and coloured voters going comprehensively to the DA in 2016, and also a little bit of a bleed off in the black electorate from the ANC to the DA in that area. And that was a very similar trend to what we saw in Nelson Mandela Bay. So it was interesting. It came early on election night. It's a really good bellwether to look at. I think it will again be a very interesting bellwether for Nelson Mandela Bay. And then just the rural Western Cape is also a very interesting bellwether for Cape Town. And I think there the DA will lose some steam and actually lose some of those municipalities that are more marginal than Cape Town. So if the trend in the Western Cape is coloured voters going away from the DA to some extent, the question is how much, right? But there are municipalities sort of on the range from, the moment they lose 1 to 5, 10, 15% of the coloured vote, whatever the swing is, there's kind of a range of municipalities in the rural Western Cape which go from the most marginal that will flip easily to will flip more difficult, but that will be an interesting indicator as what happens in the rural Western Cape. And then finally, I think like the smaller ring municipalities in Gauteng around the cities, so like Randfontein, Western Area, Midvaal, etc. The townships that have smaller voting stations in those areas have voting trends that are interesting and predictive of what will happen in the metros in Gauteng, which I think will be very interesting and obviously results to look at early on election night.
Yeah, I think it will be very interesting to watch a coalition government forming in eThekwini between the EFF, the IFP, and the DA, because they have pretty much almost a similar kind of vote, like in the high tens. So if the ANC were to fall below 50%, that kind of coalition government, if it were to form, would almost be like media headlines every day.
Well, I think that's a very interesting question that you raised, because the noises that we're hearing from the DA now are basically that any form of EFF cooperation is a complete non-starter. And the actual question is whether the DA is going to be open and willing to work with the ANC in some of these councils. So form a kind of, broad coalition with the ANC around some, agreed to technocratic principles, whether they'll be able to do that. Because I think it's either that or EFF ANC coalitions at this stage, given the DA's position to refuse to work with the EFF. So, I think that'll be very interesting to see what happens. And my expectation is that the DA will rather be in opposition than work with the ANC. But I think that will be one of the very interesting debates and very interesting pressure points in our politics kind of period. It's the election and after.
So I've spoken to Gareth van Onselen, and he mentioned in Cape Town a particular party that we should also be focusing on is the Cape Colour Congress. Do you think they will also be gaining some council seats and be taking some of that coloured votes from the DA?
Yeah, sure. I think in the Western Cape a little bit. I think Good will be the bigger player in the Western Cape in that portion of the electorate. So I think Good will do very well, particularly in the Southern Cape and also in Cape Town. So I think, and frankly, the Patriotic Alliance as well. The Patriotic Alliance and Good is going to be the major players in the coloured electorate. That's what we've seen from the by-elections, right? And where a lot of that DA vote will go. Some of it will go to the ANC as well. But the Cape Colour Congress is a very small party, Cape Town-based party. They probably will take some seats, the Cape Flats, not win wards, but win PR seats off the DA by winning, slivers of the vote and a bunch of those areas. So yeah, they probably will play a role.
Do you think the DA has sort of a strategy that they can't really win, or they're going to struggle to win the rural ANC vote? So their path to the union buildings is to focus on the metropoles, the cities, to win bigger middle class and urban voters, to increase the majorities from like 55 to like 65 in Cape Town, and to increase their majorities in Tshwane. Don't bother going to KwaZulu-Natal, just win the cities.
So I don't think the DA has any path or a remote ambition to go to the union buildings at this stage. I think the DA is trying to hold on to be a 20% or 22% party at this point. I think it's an almost nonsensical conversation to have about the DA's path to the union buildings. I just don't see any conceivable path to, right now on that. Maybe in the coming years, election cycles from now. But just given the current trajectory of the party, I think it's just a highly unlikely situation. But if you talk about a path to the union buildings at the national level for the party that is not about expropriation, that is not coming from the left, it's sort of a centrist, non-racial or multiracial party, depending on how you want to put it. That path just mathematically has kind of always looked something like the following. So a coalition of essentially all minority voters, so white, colored, and Indian voters, overwhelming majorities in that portion of the electorate, at incredibly high turnout. So it requires insanely high minority turnout and very strong majorities in those areas. Basically what the DA achieved in that portion of the electorate in 2016, right? So if you take that and you plus somewhere between 25 and 30% of the black electorate, you could get into like the mid to early 40s nationally, and then you would potentially be able to form a coalition when you cobble together like the bits and pieces that are left in the Freedom Fund Plus and the IFP, etc., etc. And so that to me has always been the kind of quantitative mathematical trajectory to get there. So then you're like, okay, well, we're going to have to get 30% of the black vote, and I think the answer is probably in a combination. It's an interesting combination of not the absolute poorest of the poor, but sort of low income black voters who have not fully benefited from the benefits of the post-94 dispensation. So if you look at the polling of black voters and you say, okay, well, who is more likely to join a coalition, a non-racial coalition of voters, to form that 30 or 35 or 25% of the black electorate to be able to get to a 40 or 45% non-racial party that's not the ANC, it would be voters that have not entered the middle class, because those voters are insanely loyal to the ANC. It would be voters that are not in dire poverty, but voters who are sort of in the middle, kind of poor voters that are in the middle. They would be most likely, just from the polling that I've seen, to switch, and they're dispersed across the entire country. So I would not so much think of it as a urban rural thing, but I'd rather think about it that kind of demographic sliver. That's it's not just a sliver; it's a huge portion of the population. But that portion of the population that has not benefited as much from the post-94 dispensation as and therefore not as loyal to the ANC. And also not in dire poverty, because those folks often are, really dependent on, for example, social grants, and perceive it kind of as, coming from the ANC. And it's difficult or challenging to break into those communities, but there's sort of a middle where there's an opportunity.
So let's do a hypothetical, and I'll say, to gain those votes that you now mentioned, you are now the campaign manager or the strategist of an opposition party in South Africa. What would you say is the key recipes for success to beat the ANC, to gain those votes, to get that 40%? What is the key recipes, what you should focus on?
Yeah. Look, I think there's 2 to 3 things in my mind about this. So the one thing is just credibility of scale and credibility of presence. So it's really important in South Africa to be perceived as a real party that has a real shot at winning, that can do real things, that's not just talking and issuing press statements, right? And being super, super, super visible in the kind of brand consciousness, in the political consciousness of the way people think about it. So you're going to have a media operation and a marketing operation that is second to none, and that is just able to occupy headspace, right?
So you need money behind you.
Yes, you need an insane amount of money, but you also need insanely good communication strategy. something to rival the EFF's level of headspace, right? So the EFF has managed to crack this idea of getting into people's headspace. They get media coverage, they captivate the imagination either by terrifying people or exciting people, but they captivate the imagination and is in people's minds, right? So a party would have to get that mind space and would have to get that credibility of scale. So that's the one thing that's critical. And by the way, credibility of scale has a lot to do also with just the credibility of who is in the stable with the party. Credible people, credible institutions, creating the sense that you will have the bench and knowledge and technocratic capabilities that are able to govern and able to make a difference if you get into power, right? That's not being a Mickey Mouse party, basically, right? So that's the critical thing, all right? So that's one really important thing. And then in my view is, look, I think for a party like that, the minority vote, if you're a credible party, would be not easy, but certainly would be a easier target than the 25 to 30% of the black electorate that you need to get to. So the real question is about the 25 to 30% of the black electorate, right? And so what do you need to target those voters? In my view is, yes, the scale and the credibility to execute is really critical. But in my view, the single most important thing is a highly credible, trusted, and concrete offer on being able to advance South Africa's transformation towards a more equal, more just society that gives those voters tangible access to economic opportunity, right? Now, the ANC, as whether you think it's done a great job or not, has an incredibly powerful political message on this. And it's called affirmative action, and it's called Black economic empowerment. And there's lots of other things around it to talk about it, but if you have a debate about which political party has a credible offer to give Black South Africans access to economic opportunity, the ANC has an unbelievably powerful argument to make. Our current opposition parties, except for the EFF, will also have a strong argument to make, do not have a strong argument to make on that score. So a political party that aims to achieve that would have to have an incredibly credible or super credible offer that is tangible and clear to those voters. And I think, unfortunately, and my DA colleagues will be annoyed as I say this, but will have to be acknowledging the racial kind of complexity of South Africa, the racial history of South Africa. And I think that offer has to be wrapped in a kind of explicit and clear offer to Black voters. What that party would do for Black South Africans. And I just think that in South Africa, given the polling I've seen, any offer that is wrapped in kind of language that is not race conscious, that is not clear about the racial implications of South Africa's history, is going to be perceived as not credible and is going to be perceived as a smokescreen for not actually implementing a real program of transformation in this country. And therefore, no matter how credible it may be under the surface, it simply will not be perceived as credible and therefore simply will not be palatable to the electorate. And I think that's what you would have to put in place. So from where we are today, I think multi decade journey required to get there from my perspective. From a centrist or center-left perspective. I think it's a much shorter journey to get there from a far-left perspective, right? If you want to cobble together a party that's not the ANC that gets 40% of the vote, it's much easier to do so to come from a radical economic transformation angle. Much, much easier. The EFF's already on their way.
But can you give us some polling to back that up? Why do you say the racial message is so important?
Well, I mean, I don't have polling that I've conducted myself. I've seen private polling from others, and when I worked at the DA, that's what the DA's own polling said. But I just think it's just kind of self-evident. If I find it just incredibly difficult to imagine that, given South Africa's history, there's a political party that says race doesn't matter to a Black voter who has been, who lives with the consequences of a racialized system who has political opponents who feast on that racial resentment, and to imagine that you would be able to crack that particular electoral conundrum, I think I'm incredibly doubtful. I think it's a reason why it's not happened yet. And I think the electoral results of the last 20 years should provide us with more than enough kind of evidence of that fact.
So to add to what you're saying is the sort of route that Musi Maimane tried to follow, that he said at the point that there is definitely white privilege, if I'm not mistaken, and he got a lot of flack for that. But so why, if Musi Maimane sort of followed the route you're now mentioning, why did he fail? What did he do wrong?
Well, he absolutely did not. I mean, the DA didn't make a credible offer to black voters under Musi Maimane's leadership. What was the DA's transformation program in the 2019 election campaign? I can't recall any. So I think the argument that you're making now is an argument that is made by certain people in the DA to deflect from I think the real problems at that time was about a lack of message, a lack of actual offer to black voters. And yes, I do think weak leadership by Musi and others in the party at the time. And look, I think it obviously was a failed election result, and I think, frankly, his leadership was not a success, clearly. But to use that experience to say that there should not be a credible offer to black South Africans in a language that appeals to the aspirations of 80% of the electorate is, in my view, just a completely incorrect reading of that situation, and in my view, actually a cynical misrepresentation of what happened in that election and build up to that election, for the purposes of shifting the DA to the right, because there are obviously folks who would like the DA to be a 20% party. It's much more comfortable to be a 20% party that's ideologically pure. It's much more complex to run a municipality like Johannesburg with a broader coalition of people who don't always agree with you on every single fact. So I think it's a willful misrepresentation to say that because Musi Maimane struggled in the 2019 election campaign, the idea of pushing the DA towards actually offering a credible transformation offer to voters is a bad idea. He did not even try to do that in that election, in my view.
Okay, that's interesting. Wow, that stunned me for a moment. So he didn't try to go for the social democratic route.
No. So look, I think he, him and the DA under him made various noises, like you said, on, for example, acknowledging white privilege, which, I mean, that's kind of one very minor little step in that direction. But what it actually would have taken is to offer a real offer of race-based transformation to black South Africans. That's what that would have taken. And the DA didn't touch that. The DA was focused on corruption. I think the other, focused on corruption, focused on the typical generic messages of job creation and so on, which haven't worked for the last 10 years, right? So it was quite a poor election campaign in general, in my view. But, the other thing to keep in mind that I think folks also just forget is that the DA had benefited for 10 years from campaigning against Jacob Zuma at the time, right? Like an absolute toxic approval rating, and just drove down the ANC's numbers massively. And then went up against a much, much, much more credible leader in Cyril Ramaphosa, right? So that election was always going to be tough for that reason. I think they handled it poorly. They could have handled the Cyril Ramaphosa complexity much better. But that's another contributing factor that I think is not so much to do about, invalidating the idea of being a more palatable party for the majority of South Africans, but in my view, is about the fact that the party didn't manage the run up to that election very well and didn't execute the election campaign very well, and frankly didn't lead to that very well. And as I said, did not have a credible offer to black South Africans in the 2019 election.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. You can easily separate those two things, Maimane's leadership and the social democratic issue. But a person like Dr. Frans Cronje from the Institute of Race Relations would say that if you're going to try and go for the social democratic route, you're going to try out Ramaphosa. You shouldn't try taking the ANC head on. And some would say you should rather take the direction that the ActionSA and Herman Mashaba is taking, sort of a free market, bit of an anti-immigration route. Do you think there's an argument to be made there that ActionSA could be a way to gain some black votes?
Yeah, so look, I think there is so maybe before I answer that question directly, so there's a slightly different view to take on this as well, right? Like we've been talking about what it would take, in my view, to build a say 40 or 45% non-racial, multiracial party, right? And that's one theory of the case, is that it's a good idea to push the ANC under 50 with a party of that nature, right? But I do acknowledge and agree that it would just be an incredibly complex, messy, potentially disastrous endeavor, because to get to 40%, you have to put a lot of people in the same tent who don't necessarily agree on all things, right? To the extent that it's going to be complex. So, and for the record, I am still in favor of that particular trajectory or route. But, there's a different view, which is, not crazy, which is the idea that, maybe the DA should be a 20% party or an 18% party or whatever the number is, that is, doggedly liberal and very steadfast in its principles, and probably barely governs the Western Cape and a couple of other councils and does well in those areas. And in the meantime, the ANC is going to lose altitude, right? I mean, we all know that. And by the way, that's the kind of quantitative inevitability that the ANC is going to go under 50% in some election in the future. And, it's becoming increasingly possible that it could be 2024, to be frank. I mean, it maybe probably later, but it could be 2024 already. So if you go the route of a doggedly liberal, ideologically pure DA that has, say, 20% of the vote, what you're essentially doing is conceding that ANC losses. No. You're conceding the ANC losses to go entirely to the left, right? Because there's no alternative on the right, or on the center at least. So those voters basically all go to the EFF or other small parties, right? But then the argument goes, well, fine. Then the day the ANC is under 50, say 45% or 40% ANC, at least you have like an ideologically functional pure DA that has 20% of the vote, who could maybe then form a coalition with the ANC. That's a potential argument to make. I think that's how a lot of I actually think that's the theory of the case that the DA is currently following, right? It's like, let's be the best little 20% party we could be, and the day the ANC comes under 50, we would be able to form a coalition with them and hopefully stave off the worst. I think it's a highly, highly risky thing to do, because it's, firstly, in the actions to get there, you alienate the ANC, right? And alienate the center of South African politics more. And you become a more minority, more Western Cape, less palatable party to form a coalition with. I mean, you also just create a more credible, larger EFF and other kind of left-wing forces that get stronger because of that. And you, of course, run the enormous risk of the ANC actually going into coalition with the EFF potentially, right?
But it's also probably a problem if you go into a coalition of the ANC, you might lose some of your voters because they thought you would not do that. The sort of the liberal white voters.
Yeah, but I do think that the reality is, in the world of an ANC under 50%, everything changes, because I think then the sort of center of gravity for liberal kind of DA voting voters across the racial spectrum is going to be, let's avoid chaos. Let's avoid an EFF-influenced government. Let's avoid the ANC doing expropriation without compensation en masse to get back the votes they've lost to the left, right? So I think it's a very dangerous scenario for South Africa, and I think that and it's kind of the trajectory we're on, right? Like, that is the trajectory we're kind of on right now. It seems that the ANC is kind of on a downward trajectory, and the DA seems at best stagnant. And so where are the votes going to go? Some small parties, but also to the likes of the EFF, right? Like, that is the trajectory we're on. And I think once we reach that point, then I think difficulty and challenges have a way of focusing the mind towards the practicalities that are maintaining macroeconomic stability, maintaining, frankly, the safety and security situation in the country, and staving off the worst of what could be a radical economic transformation agenda that basically destroys South Africa's economy, right? Like, that's a distinct possibility if this goes the wrong way. So But anyway, so I mean, those are two theories of the case, right? And I think the DA is on the theory of going for the functional, ideologically pure 20% party. Not what I would have counseled, but that I think this is what the party has chosen, at least for now.
And ActionSA, Herman Mashaba.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that ActionSA has not yet, in my mind, come over the very first hurdle I spoke about when you asked me, what does it take to succeed? It takes the credibility of scale and the credibility of not being a Mickey Mouse party. I think they've not been able to kickstart enough credibility and momentum and scale to get there. I know it's early days for them, and it's a bit of an unfair judgment because they're also doing it in coronavirus, but I'm afraid that's just how the electorate is going to judge them. So that's I think the one major concern. The other major concern from my perspective is that the ActionSA, the way it's positioned now and functioning, and what I just sense from what I see on social media, so this is an unscientific opinion, it just seems to basically be a DA splinter party, right? Like it's a party that's going to splinter out some of the DA's black vote and maybe some of its liberal white vote, like who knows. And the relative value of that, it's relatively limited. The question is how much of the ANC vote is able to carve out. Honestly, we have no idea, right? There's no quantitative evidence of that whatsoever.
What's interesting to me is in a recent interview, Herman Mashaba was asked why did he leave the DA, and he said the DA can't win. So he didn't say he didn't agree with the DA's policies. He flat out admitted the DA can't win. It's an interesting admission for someone to make. It's like, oh, pretty much I agree with them. It's just I can't win with them. So I'm going to form my separate party. It's an interesting admission to make.
But I don't think that's crazy. In a country where we do not, our state and our government is increasingly not getting the very basics right. The very basics of keeping the roads, filled in, keeping the electricity on, keeping the water on, stopping murder, mayhem, and overall chaos. Not, engaging in grand theft and scale and looting and I mean government state looting of officials, like the digital vibes kind of things. Not, increasingly struggling to not get that right. I have sympathy for the view which says, geez, if you're in opposition in South Africa and you want to get something done, or you want to improve the country, geez, we just need to get stuff done. And getting stuff done requires you to actually win. It's actually one of the critical stumbling blocks to getting things done differently. And if that means certain sacrifices, certain compromises, and taking a different route, I have sympathy for Herman's view. Like, sure, yeah, he's roughly ideologically about 80 or 90% where the DA is, but he's done what he's done because he thinks that he can win. And actually, winning is just almost the single most important thing now, just given that the state has to be rehabilitated, and it requires new leadership to be rehabilitated, right? So, I'm sorry, this is a long answer, but I was on RSG the other day, and I was commenting on a call-in show, and folks were calling, and the purpose of the show is folks were calling in to talk about delivery in their local areas, right, in small towns or whatever, and they were just talking about total state collapse, and the chaos that comes with it, and just basically it's horrific, like small towns in South Africa that service delivery has basically ceased. And it just made me reflect, what is the value for those voters of a principled 10% DA in a rural town in Northwest, when the town is being run into the absolute ground? Nothing. It has no value. It has no value to those voters. What has value to those voters is, at the very minimum, scaring the ANC local government to the extent that they can actually deliver. But what would have even much more value is actually forming an alternative government in that council that can win. And if you've made the decision to be a doggedly liberal, ideologically pure party that spends 90% of its time railing against the ANC, you're not going to win in that town. You're not going to get close. You're not going to scare the ANC in that town. You have no value to those voters. So I really have a lot of sympathy for Herman's view from that perspective.
No,
and this is not a scientific view, but I just think that a very large and growing number of South Africans share that perspective. It's like the era of being a 20% party that issues great press statements and makes great speeches from the benches of parliament. The relative value of that is diminishing very rapidly. That was a valuable proposition in the 90s when we had to prove that opposition politics was credible, when we had to prove that folks could speak out against the ANC, when we had to prove that a conviction-based politics was possible in South Africa, that you could make intellectual arguments that were not anti-arguments. But that value, as I've said, is diminishing rapidly. It's about what you can physically do for people's lives now. And a 20% party can't do anything.
No, I agree definitely that Mashaba's route makes sense to me as well. It's just interesting to me that he would admit it on national television. It's like, I'm not even going to bother playing the role. They can't win. I'm going to do this right. And
I think there's a certain simplicity, directness, and authenticity that is great about that. The voters know that. I am not a fan of Donald Trump in any way whatsoever, but I will say the man had an ability to at least
say what he's thinking,
speaking his mind and say what he's thinking. And I think sometimes he was thinking really problematic things.
Yeah.
but he was saying what he was thinking, and I think you should not underestimate the relative attractiveness of that.
No, absolutely. On a last note, our honorable member, our esteemed former president, has now been arrested and is in jail. Do you think this is the end of corruption or the beginning of the end of corruption, or do you think this is just a ploy? They're focusing on Magashule and Zuma just to get votes, and after the election, it's back to business as usual?
No, look, this is absolutely not a ploy, it's not a ploy, and it's definitely not the end of corruption, right? So there's a couple of things that we know about politics in South Africa, right? The one thing that we know is that the ANC is an enormous hulk of an organization, and the thing that keeps it together, and I'm an absolute internal mess about those things, not that I know that much about internal ANC politics, but just as an external observer, and what keeps it together is access to state resources, and the disbursement and systematic disbursement of that patronage, right? Like, I think that is an absolutely critical part of how the ANC functions in government and as a political party. And so, yes, it's the Jacob Zuma saga is, it's a great thing for South Africa, and I think it's great that the judiciary has held the line on that. But I think making any argument that this is sort of like an enormous turning point, I think personally I have huge doubts about that and would have to see much, much, much more before I start credibly believing that. I don't think it's a ploy, because I do think that that particular wing of the ANC was engaged in just shocking state capture, right? Like, and the corruption that came with it. And it's fantastic that there's now a credible criminal case against that, and it's being persecuted systematically, and those are all really good things. But does that mean that the patronage network that exists in the ANC is going to stop doing what it does? No. Does it mean that the culture that has been embedded in the next 10 years, in the last decade of Zuma governance, is going to change? No, I think that's going to take a really long time to change, and it's probably going to take a rehabilitation of the state under new leadership to change. And so, and just the classic example is this digital vibes contract, right? Like, William Kize he's like one of the good guys, right? Like, he's one of the good guys in Ramaphosa's cabinet. He's like part and parcel of basically the post-Zuma cleanup crew, right? And it's just shocking. This, like, I don't know. I actually have not been following every detail of the saga, but I just read I think it was the City Press thing this weekend about just where the money flowed, and it's shocking. It's insane, and it's just like rampant. It's horrific. So The fact that he could be involved in something like that just points to me that no, the fact that Jacob Zuma is being arrested and is properly had his day in court finally, is definitely does not mean the end of corruption in South Africa.
Yeah, no, the corruption. So perhaps Ramaphosa has good intentions, but the corruption is so sieved in the institutions that it's almost impossible to get rid of it. It's like I think that's a problem with a president like Zuma, because the top guy was doing it. Everyone felt, okay, he's getting away with it. I can do a bit of that as well, and then it sort of slivered down, and everyone became involved in corruption. I read an interesting article that the former Kenyan president, he got into power with an anti-corruption message, and he was a very good guy. But eventually, he also became involved in corruption because the author pointed out that it was so in the institutions. It was like he had to do it. It was almost like he had to get involved in it to fight the game. I know it's So yes, I think South Africa has interesting times ahead with But yeah, this has been a very fascinating, interesting conversation, Dawie. I want to give you one last opportunity to add, plug, or say anything that you want to.
No, that's fine. Thanks, Donald. It's been great.
Okay, well, to our viewers, if you've made it this far, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. My name is Donald. This has been WorldView.